Welcome to News from Neptune for the 44th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism. Close quote. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, etc. It just means that the discussion of socialism and capitalism is obfuscated in our current discussion. Since the last decade of that 20th century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things tonight on a Why Vote edition of News from Neptune. I mean why vote, both as a question and as an answer. First as a question, why vote, rhetorically placed, because we can't vote for the things we want. End to wars and U.S. war crimes, jobs, income, education, health care, none of those things are offered by any candidate in the upcoming election. Second, I mean why vote as an answer to a question. Why did Americans vote as they did in the last presidential election? David, you alluded to that too, and that seems to be an important topic for us to discuss on the eve of the midterm elections next Tuesday. What's on your list?
Indeed. Right to the topic, right, and we don't even plan this. We just have been working together too long.
The world plans it for us.
So, a new paper by the political scientist, by America's preeminent political scientist regarding these matters, Thomas Ferguson, who wrote a previous paper analyzing the outcomes of the 2016 election, which put Donald Trump into office. And this one is co-written with Benjamin Page. So this is a really murderer's row of prominent, good political scientists. Page, of course, is noted for his recent study with Martin Gilens, in terms of which, again, deals with the question of why vote, when they found that 70% of the people have no say in what government does. In this paper, The Economic and Social Roots of Populist Rebellion, Support for Donald Trump in 2016, it's summarized in the following abstract. This paper critically analyzes voting patterns in the 2016 U.S. presidential election using survey data from the American National Election Survey and aggregate data on congressional districts. It assesses the roles that economic and social factors played in Donald J. Trump's populist, quote-unquote, candidacy. They put populist in quote. It shows the hollowness of claims that economic issues played little or no role. The hollowness of claims that economic issues played little or no role in the campaign, and that social factors such as race or gender suffice to explain the outcome, while agreeing that racial resentment and sexism were important influences. The paper shows how various economic considerations helped. In a related matter, we find Jonathan Cook, who seems to be about the only one clearly talking sense on Counterpunch these days. I mean, there's people talking sense about many different issues, but not very many people talking sense about this issue. His topic is the recent election this past Sunday of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, the title of the article is "Bolsonaro, a Monster Engineered by our Media," trying to debunk the notion, Jonathan Cook does, that it's simply social media. In this article, to summarize one point that is made in this article, one general point, what Jonathan Cook argues by quoting somebody he doesn't agree with, he says the following: "Here is Simon Jenkins, a veteran British gatekeeper, a former editor of the Times of London, who now writes a column in The Guardian, pontificating on Bolsonaro." Quote what Brian Jenkins says: the lesson for champions of open democracy is glaring. Its values cannot be taken for granted. When debate is no longer through regulated media, courts and institutions, politics will default to the mob, says Brian Jenkins in The Guardian. Social media, once hailed as an agent of global concord, has become the purveyor of falsity, anger, and hatred. Its algorithms polarize opinion. Its pseudo-information drives argument to the extremes, end quote, Simon Jenkins. And Jonathan Cook's astute comment on that and critical comment on that is, in his ironic way, this is now the default consensus of the corporate media, whether in its right-wing incarnations or of the variety posing on the liberal left end of the spectrum like The Guardian. The people are stupid, and we need to be protected from their base instincts. Social media, it is claimed, has unleashed humanity's id. Add to that a couple of brief ones in the New York Times. Thomas Edsall, a day or two ago in his weekly think piece, usually relying on social science, quotes various political science studies, political psychology studies, which are purporting to prove that there are two kinds of voters. Again, why vote? Yeah. There are did you happen to read this one, Carl? Yeah, I know. No, yeah, that's okay. Good. Yeah, well, no, I mean, the studies are bad, and Thomas Edsall has been getting worse. But political psychology, watch out for political psychology, especially in the New York Times. These people are going around dividing up voters into fluid voters and rigid voters. And it's the rigid voters who vote for Donald Trump and the fluid voters who vote for Hillary Clinton. And you could read that and see how that's defined in these political science studies. And just one more quote from Max Fisher, the so-called interpreter of the New York Times editorial page, in his concern about this populist uprising from just this morning. He usually writes with our friend Amanda Taub, but this is just him. Human beings are tribal by nature. Our instincts are to put our group first and see ourselves as locked in competition with other groups. Liberal democracy, which promises that everyone gains when rights are protected for all, asks us to suppress those impulses. But this is no easy task, and tribal instincts tend to come to the fore in times of scarcity or insecurity, when our capacity for lofty ideals and long-term planning is weakest. In other words, he infers the economic basis for this dissatisfaction. He doesn't go into it in any depth, as Thomas Ferguson has done, or as Jonathan Cook would do, or as many other people would do. But he goes on to talk about these so-called tribal instincts, or as Jonathan Cook referred to, the kind of id, as being responsible for the elections of people like Trump in this country and Bolsonaro in Brazil. Now, this isn't to endorse Bolsonaro in any way, shape, or form, and we can talk about what the differences might be in the Brazilian context and the Trump context, and then we can talk about Trump and what he's been up to, and we can go on and talk about other things. But I just wanted to put that stuff on the table as a general framework that to which we need to constantly refer back to what the economic material basis for these political phenomenon are.
I think we need to start with the fact that there is a settled narrative in the American political discussion, a narrative that is endorsed and frequently repeated by the Washington Post and the New York Times, by the American political establishment in general, about how Donald Trump accidentally became president of the United States. Now, this narrative is, of course, the narrative that the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign and their allies in the so-called permanent government, from the Pentagon to the intelligence community, want you to believe. It's the account that tells you that Trump is a racist and a misogynist, and he was elected because there are many Americans in that basket of deplorables who are racist and misogynist, and they really shouldn't be allowed to vote.
Don't forget xenophobic. Don't forget xenophobic.
Oh, well, of course, xenophobia goes along with that. Because
right.
a lot of those people are abroad are female and
Yes,
black.
absolutely.
Right?
Or at least brown.
But this narrative, this account, and it's quite, I must say, one of the most remarkable things that I've seen, paralleled only by the Russiagate hysteria and the common assumption by the New York Times and the Washington Post that the 2016 election was stolen with Russian help, is the way in which this narrative, this account, this explanation of how Trump became president is accepted by the standard media, by the opinion-forming media. It's astonishing, and it's. I think the situation is what David described from this very important recent report on why people did indeed vote for Trump, and the essential conclusion from the work of Ferguson and Gillens and their colleagues is that this was a populist revolt in the sense that populism is an objection to the economic exploitation of the majority by the elite. It was not race and misogyny that fueled the Trump victory so much as economic distress. Now, that's important, and there are parallels, certainly, to the Brazilian election. I don't know that they need to be overstressed because, I don't need to be overstressed, of course. I don't think that they should be looked on as that parallel, given the very different nature of the proposals of Bolsonaro and Trump. The suggestion that they are both supported by what is in fact a worldwide populist objection to the neoliberal and neoconservative governments of the United States and its allies, that seems to me to be correct. But until we understand that the Trump's election was not an accident, that it does represent a political transformation that's taking place in the United States, and that the American ruling class is quite worried about. It's quite worried about a restless populace, and doesn't quite know yet how it intends to treat it. Is it enough to drive Trump from office? I was astonished the other night at the debate between the contenders for the House seat from this district. The incumbent Republican and the Democratic challenger centered on whether the election of the Democrat would lead to the impeachment of Trump. This was the line that our Republican incumbent member of the House took in that debate. Now, there are a lot of things he could have said in that debate. There are a lot of ways in which I think the Democratic candidate could have been criticized, but Rodney Davis chose none of them. Instead, he hammered on the notion that the election of Betsy Dirksen-Londrigan would add another vote to the impeachment of Donald Trump. very strange, but it's based on his assessment that the populist revolt that produced Trump was worth massaging for votes. So we're in a position where I think there is a looking glass war going on in American politics. That is to say, things are distorted, a distorting mirror approach to what's actually going on in American politics, and the distortion isn't an accident. The distortion is the attempt by the American political system to deny what it fears. That is, a populist revolt in the United States that criticizes the policies of all recent administrations. Remember, Donald Trump was the first major party presidential candidate in 40 years actually to criticize the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the previous administration. Those are the policies that produce more war. Obama was at war throughout 2 presidential terms. That hadn't happened before. Those policies produce more war and more inequality. Inequality not only increased, but it accelerated during the Obama years, as it had in the previous administrations. Now, when Trump steps up and criticizes those policies, regardless of what he actually does in office, when he criticizes those policies, he attracts enough voters, or at least convinces enough voters to stay home, that he emerges as president. This is not just an accident. This is certainly is accidental from the point of view of the American political establishment. But what's happened here is that this populist objection to the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the last 40 years of American government are coming home to roost. The sky is dark with chickens coming home to roost, as Lady Alexander Coburn used to say, and it seems to me he's right.
But what makes it so difficult for even those on the left to begin to sort this out is that every incident from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh seems to add to this argument that fascism is on the loose, that neo-fascism is on the loose, whether in a individualized or larger collective form, and just what that means, what it means to have authoritarian leadership, what it means to have a cult of personality, what it means that, how anti-Semitism and racism play into all of this. And I've been frustrated. And
you were talking about...
Yes, I was talking about Pittsburgh. So,
yeah,
I mean,
yes.
This is a can of worms to open up. But I've had trouble finding anyone. What Pittsburgh sets loose is, of course, the whole debate about anti-Semitism on the right or left. Clearly, it's on the right in this case, but what is it? It is anti-Semitism. It is a person who's been obviously influenced by anti-Semitic, rhetoric. But does this mean anti-Semitism is on the rise? Does this mean that anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head as a sort of collective force in U.S. politics or in U.S. culture? And it seems to be taken for granted from the left and the right, or from the real news on the left to the Zionist right, that this, for different reasons, that this is true. And I'm not getting at how this is true. I guess to put a point on that, when I hear Juan Gonzalez on Democracy Now refer to Anti-Defamation League studies as a way of supporting this point, then I'm very skeptical, because ADL studies are notoriously constructed to, in every case, exaggerate what the number of anti-Semitic incidences in this country is, because that's their bread and butter. So there's some good stuff on Mondoweiss about this. There's some good stuff about critiques of Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, and his response. But we should also be talking about, as I've been saying the whole time, I thought it was a bad move post-election of Trump for left-wing pro-Palestinian groups, like Jewish Voice for Peace to heighten alerts about right-wing anti-Semitism. I thought that was a bad move politically and not an accurate reflection of what brought Trump to power and what is going on the populist right in this country.
And the massacre in Pittsburgh makes it more difficult in some ways to see how anti-Semitism is being manipulated this way in this country, and far more so, by the way, in Britain. The amazing development of the narrative of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and indeed in the Corbyn campaign is not to be believed. In some ways, that's even more fantastic than the Russiagate nonsense in this country. But the horrible events in Pittsburgh are nothing to ignore in this regard. The analysis of them and the connection of them to American politics in general, that's another matter, and that's what needs to be debated.
Yeah, back to, I don't want to spend too much time on this fellow, but the reigns of the ADL, formerly under Abraham Foxman for decades, have been taken over by this younger guy, middle-aged guy, Jonathan Greenblatt. Not to be confused with another Greenblatt, I think Jason Greenblatt, who's one of Donald Trump's aides, or whatever. Jonathan Greenblatt actually used to be in the Obama White House. Good preparation for, I guess, for that sort of work. And he's equally blaming, in his comments after Pittsburgh, he was equally blaming anti-Semitism on the right and left. And there's all this hair pulling about the Jewish community and divisiveness within the Jewish community. And I can't find anyone on even on Mondoweiss or on the Real News or on the Counterpunch or on other websites talking some sense about what the Pittsburgh thing actually means, what it means in relation to anti-Semitism in this country, and how everybody gloms onto it to promote their pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian in the sense of the Jewish Voice for Peace wanting to rightfully place anti-Semitism on the right, where the real anti-Semitism actually is, but in the meantime exaggerating it in that context.
You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the false narratives of American politics, which gives us plenty of room to move around. Ever since the Russiagate allegations began to appear more than 2 years ago, the notion that Russia elected Trump, their core narrative has revolved around purported Kremlin attempts to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election on behalf of Donald Trump. In recent months, a number of leading American media outlets have taken that argument even further, suggesting that Putin's Kremlin actually put Trump in the White House and now is similarly trying to affect the November 6 midterm elections, particularly House contests, on behalf of Trump and the Republican Party. I don't know how much Rodney Davis has received from Donald Trump, from President Putin, but I'm sure he'll tell us if we ask. According to the page 1 New York Times report, Putin's agents, quote, are engaging in an elaborate campaign of information warfare to interfere with the American midterm elections on Tuesday. That's not some scandal sheet. That's the New York Times telling us about how the Russians are ruining Tuesday's election. Despite well-documented articles by Gareth Porter and Aaron Mate effectively dismantling these allegations about 2016 and 2018, the mainstream media continues to promote them. The occasionally acknowledged lack of public evidence is sometimes cited as itself evidence of a deep Russian conspiracy. Those conspirators are so good that they even hide their tracks, of the Kremlin's arsenal of disruption capabilities to sow havoc on election day. Hey, they're really good at this. They got Trump elected, right? Lost in these reckless allegations is the long-term damage they may themselves do to American democracy. Consider the following possibilities. even though still unproven, charges that the Kremlin put Trump in the White House have cast a large shadow of illegitimacy over his presidency. Of course, that's what the Democrats at all want, and thus over the institution of the presidency itself. This is unlikely to end entirely with Trump. If the Kremlin had the power to affect the outcome of one presidential election, why not another one, whether won by a Republican or a Democrat? The 2016 presidential election was the first time such an allegation became widespread in American political history, but it may not be the last. Noam Chomsky has frequently observed that fear is a characteristic of American politics from very early on. Fear, there's a good reason for that. Any society based on the destruction of Native Americans and the enslavement of Native Africans for its ascendancy has a lot to worry about, so to speak, if there is any justice in this world. But the fear that Americans, the settler colonial society of America, has shown from the beginning is once again picked up by the fear of those Russians who are even corrupting our election. The poets often get there first, the artists, the filmmakers, and the concern about his precious bodily fluids shown by the general in the famous film Dr. Strangelove looks absolutely prescient. It's the fear that the Russiagate thing has tapped into that is a characteristic of a guilty American society. That's hardly surprising. But what we get is this Russiagate nonsense. And if U.S. elections are really so vulnerable to Russian meddling, what does this say about faith in American elections more generally? How many losing candidates on November 6th will resist blaming the Kremlin? 2 years after the last presidential election, Hillary Clinton and her adamant supporters still have not been able to do so. That is, to give up the notion that the Russians made Trump president. We know from critical reporting and from recent opinion surveys that the origins and continuing fixation on the Russiagate scandal since 2016 have been primarily a product of U.S. political intelligence and media elites. It's not an accident. It's not just a cloud. People are working on this. It did not spring from the American people, from voters themselves. Thus, a Gallup poll recently showed that 58% of those surveyed wanted improved relations with Russia. Americans are not fools. We know that bad relations with a nuclear-armed power are not a good idea. Other surveys have shown that Russiagate is scarcely an issue at all for likely voters on November 6. Nonetheless, it remains a front-page issue for U.S. elites and for the candidates. Indeed, Russiagate has revealed the low esteem that many U.S. political media elites have for American voters, as David was just discussing, for their ability to make discerning, rational electoral decisions, which is the bedrock assumption of a representative democracy. It's worth noting that this disdain for rank-and-file citizens echoes a long-standing attitude of the Russian political intelligentsia, as recently expressed in the argument by a prominent Moscow policy intellectual that Russian authoritarianism springs not from the nation's elites, but from the genetic code of its people. The Russians are that way because they're naturally that way. U.S. elites seem to have a similar skepticism about, or contempt for, American voters' capacity to make discerning electoral choices. Presumably, this is a factor behind the current proliferation of programs, official, corporate, and private, to introduce elements of censorship in the nation's media space in order to filter out Kremlin propaganda. Here it also seems elites will decide what constitutes such propaganda. The Washington Post recently gave such an example, quote, portraying Russian and Syrian government forces favorably as they battled terrorists and what U.S. officials for years have portrayed as a legitimate uprising against the authoritarian government of President Bashar al-Assad. That is, thinking that the forces of Putin and Assad were fighting terrorists, even if closer to the truth, is Kremlin propaganda, because it's at variance with, quote, what U.S. officials for years have been saying, close quote. This was the guiding principle of Soviet censorship as well, by the way. If the American electoral process, presidency, legislature, and voter cannot be fully trusted, what is left of American democracy? Admittedly, this is still only a trend, a foreboding, but one with no end in sight. If it portends the undermining of American democracy, our elites will blame the Kremlin. But they best recall the discovery of Walt Kelly's legendary cartoon figure, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." That's where this Russiagate harm actually comes from. That's, by the way, from Stephen Cohen, the Russian specialist.
So I hope this isn't too much off on a tangent, but just to get back to the rhetoric about the Pittsburgh shooter feeding off of the Trump culture, that somehow somehow Trump's rhetoric and the things that have been going on, the whole immigrant bashing thing, which is obviously horrible and deserves to be mentioned. I mean, Trump is awful with the whole caravan thing. It's awful stuff. There's plenty of awful stuff that Trump says and does. I don't want to be misunderstood in that regard. But the idea that Trump creates a culture, that we have these mass shootings going on for 20, 30 years now, not to mention wars. And
they're bound up together.
Yeah. And so a guy goes into Pittsburgh and all of a sudden, I mean, I may be overstating what they're saying about this, but the idea that they just have to say that in the age of Trump, this takes on a new meaning, like it wouldn't when Dylan Roof went in and killed a bunch of black people in Charleston. It wasn't quite, Obama, of course, wasn't blamed for that, nor should he have been. But and clearly Trump's rhetoric is different than Obama's. But how does the rhetoric and how does the culture come out? How does it relate to this one guy? I don't want to reduce everything to mental illness or character either. But, it seems like we use these categories, whether it's at a sort of social level or cultural level or individual level, as is we use them to make points that have already been made, to support arguments that have already been made. In the case of Trump, it's like, well, this is happening under Trump's watch, so it must be the Trump's authoritarian, populist, racist political culture.
As you say, a very different reaction we got for Obama's association with the horrible murders in Charleston.
And in fact, they were seen as someone challenging Obama's authority, right. which in many ways they probably were. But how does that translate? I mean, how does that translate into understanding, into moving beyond this idea that whatever happens now just supports this idea that we're on the road to fascism?
And the quite reasonable excoriation Trump has received for his outrageous behavior vis-a-vis the Honduran Caravan has not been joined to any positive proposals by the political establishment that wants to view what Trump does with alarm here, as indeed we should.
Yeah.
No positive proposals and no recognition that the conditions people are fleeing in Honduras are a result of American policy. Actually, in regard to Honduras, specifically Hillary Clinton's policy as Secretary of State. So there's a washing of the hands of this matter by the Democrats, when what we would think an opposition party would be doing in regard to Trump's awful behavior in regard to the immigrants is making proposals that would help them, that help the immigrants, help the problem, establishing some sort of residence and some sort of refugee status for these people who are fleeing a situation that the U.S. Had a big hand in creating. But that's not what we're getting from our opposition party. That's not the sort of thing they want. They're much more concerned with using it as a stick to beat Trump with. Okay, fine. But let's have some real politics in this country and try to deal with some of the crimes that the U.S. has committed around the world, particularly crimes of war and repression, that produces these horrible situations that the Trump administration is responding to badly.
Yeah. The problem I've been having with the Real News in particular, which I sort of rely on for reporting, for doing journalism and thinking some of these things through, which in the Russiagate instance, they do a very good job of, obviously, with Aaron, Mate, and Stephen Cohen and so forth. But they've just caved into the whole fascism idea.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul Jay did a long interview after the Pittsburgh thing, about an hour-long interview with Ben Norton. I like both of these guys. They both do good work. But it's like they have to capitulate to the notion that there's a serious fascist element going on here. And they put it into context, they qualify it in various ways, they talk about the economic background, but when it gets down to it, there's this insidious right-wing populist, fascist, racist force in this country that has to be reckoned with in some way apart from the material circumstances. And it's this idea that we keep encounter, and this is gonna this is get a little academic here, but the conversation that we often have about race and class has to do with David Rhetoric, the historian, former UI professor, David Rhetoric's idea in his book, The Wages of Whiteness, where he talks about racism beyond economic and material circumstances having a quote-unquote life of its own. And in recent days, Carl, literally, I have heard Paul Jay, that's what he said on this hour-long interview, that anti-Semitism in this country has a life of its own. And I was shocked to hear that. I don't think anti-Semitism in this country has a life of its own to any effect on the lives of Jews or the opportunities of Jews or the safety of Jews, regardless of the Pittsburgh thing. This horrible crime needs to be put in a different context than that. That doesn't mean that there aren't anti-Semites. That doesn't mean that there aren't Nazis, and so forth. But no, anti-Semitism doesn't have a life of its own. And in the same way that I don't think we could talk about racism having a life of its own, but there are good arguments. There are arguments back and forth in this context, mainly put forward by people like Adolph Reid and so forth, opposite to Reuter's comments, that racism doesn't have a life of its own if we understand class, the relationship between class and race properly.
We also might ask whose interests are served by separating race and class. Whose interests are served by suggesting that racism has a life of its own and you needn't pay any attention to class here? Yeah. The work of the Field sisters on an important study, Racecraft, from a few years ago, does actually a brilliant job of talking about slavery in America as a matter of race relations, being the prevalent mode, more than prevalent, amongst American historians. The Field sisters respond that you must realize that the point of slavery was not to produce racism, it was to produce cotton, that it was an economic and class structure justified by racist tropes, but those racist tropes were not a description of what was really going on. And they attempted to separate race and class in the way that David was just discussing. We can't do that. And that's bound up with a lot of the discussion of identity politics in this country in the last generation and more. And we mentioned that theme frequently here, but it's returning in a particularly murderous fashion right now when we have to deal with these vast tragedies, both at home and abroad, that people ascribe to racism, absence any reference to class.
And I would commend, recommend the interviews that Adolph Reid has done in last year, including recently, several of them on the podcast Dead Pundits Society, a fellow named Adam Proctor. Podcasts, I think, for some people are difficult, especially some older people, including myself. It's annoying sometimes the way they drop F-bombs in some of these podcasts. But I think that the interviews recently, lengthy interviews with Adolph Reid about the issues of race and class, are very good at an academic and political level. And he also, I think he has a recent article on the Baffler website about African American based movies, in which he critiques that in his very interesting and insightful way.
There's a piece from Bruce Dixon on the Black Agenda.
I was going to mention BAR too. Yeah.
Black Agenda Report, BAR, is up there with Counterpunch and some of the other websites and whatnot that are opposing the common narrative right now in a particularly impressive way. We recommend them highly, and we'll post the ones we referred to tonight on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Bruce Dixon, the BAR editor, wrote this week, "How thirsty and stupid do most progressive Democrat congressional candidates think we are?" Interesting way to put it. He says the midterm elections are a week away. He wrote this past week. The midterm elections are a week away, and I can't find anybody worth voting for. I live in Georgia, the 6th congressional district, where Stacey Abrams is a Democrat running for governor, and Lucy MacBeth is the Democrat congressional candidate. MacBeth is running 4 points behind Republican incumbent Karen Handel. Stacey Abrams has been polling only 2 points behind Brian Kemp, well within the polling margin of error for months now. For those outside Georgia, if Donald Trump is some kind of horrible bad grandpa, Brian Kemp and his especially mean uncle out of Athens, Georgia, normally a pretty liberal college town. Kemp ran commercials in which he blew up stuff, fired up his big chainsaw to cut regulations, waved his guns that nobody better try to take, and slammed the door of that big truck he's got in case he has to, quote, round up some criminal illegals and take them home myself. This is what passes for politics in this election. Republican Kemp has been the blowhard, has been Georgia's Secretary of State in charge of Georgia's elections for 8 years now, during which time he struck about 1 million or so, mostly minority voters, off the rolls, interfered with voter registration drives, and caused several tens of thousands of other new voter registrations to simply disappear. This is standard Republican practice across the country because the numbers of their dependable vote are shrinking. So Republicans try to hold down the vote in Democratic areas, and Democrats try to maximize registration and turnout. 6th District Congresswoman Karen Handel, the incumbent, was Brian Kemp's predecessor in the office of Georgia's Secretary of State for 8 years. In that capacity, she disappeared her own share of minority voters and votes. She also had a hand in cooperation with the crooked Democrat who held that office before her in bringing Diebold's faith-based voting machines into Georgia. Diebold Company makes these voting machines that have been excoriated as a possible source of voter fraud. The Democrat running against Handel is Lucy MacBeth, the progressive Democrat Lucy MacBeth. Her son was murdered in Jacksonville, Florida, back in 2012 for the crime of playing his music too loud. And since then, MacBeth has become a professional gun control advocate. The big problem, though, with the professional gun control advocates are completely unable to point the way to a less violent society without telling the truth about America's present and past. The narrative the professional gun control advocates spin around gun control generally ignores the official violence of police and military. In the real world, the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was written to guarantee that every able-bodied white man was armed and ready to take part in slave patrols or Indian killing and land-stealing militias. What chattel slavery mostly ended and the theft of the continent, when chattel slavery mostly ended and the theft of the continent was complete, the gun industry had to find other markets and other reasons for existing, and some of what they came up with included the myths about civilians with pistols being able to hold the government accountable and more. An even bigger problem with Lucy MacBeth, the progressive Democrat, is like many 2018 so-called progressive Democrat congressional candidates this year, MacBeth is running for U.S. Congress without a single word to say about foreign policy. Didn't figure at all in the debates, recent debates, between Dirksen Londrigan and our incumbent congressman here in Illinois. MacBeth is running for U.S. Congress without a single word to say about foreign policy except a vow of support for the apartheid state of Israel. She's a candidate for U.S. Congress without a word to say about the 4 or 5 countries we're bombing, I think he underestimates there, or the dozens of other countries we're deploying special forces in, or flying drones over and flying drones into. Almost a congresswoman, Lucy, won't talk to us at all about the 800 U.S. military bases, another underestimate probably, around the world, which costs us $1 trillion a year, more than what the next 9 or 10 nations spend put together, and reporters don't ask. The Republicans don't bring it up either, a sure sign this is something they pretty much agree on. And then there's Stacey Abrams. The Abrams campaign for governor of Georgia has been featured across the country. Stacey is a tax attorney, Spelman and Yale, graduated from Spelman and Yale Law. She was first state rep from an Atlanta district in 2006. In American legislatures, party caucus leaders are chosen by the amount they bring into party coffers in donations from PACs, corporations, and wealthy individuals, and their expertise in doling it out to other lawmakers. By 2011, Stacey Abrams was chosen Democratic leader in the Georgia House, a post which she held until beginning her run for governor in 2017. She's written several romance novels on the side, too. Stacey Abrams wants to be president, and Georgia governor is one of the check marks on the way there. An election to governor will immediately put her on the short list of contenders. She lays that out quite clearly in her latest book, Minority Leader, How to Lead from the Outside and Make Real Change. It's a memoir-centered self-help book, and I did it, you can do it too, kind of thing, with checklists at the end of every chapter. The it she talks about in the book is achieving power. But for all her deep understanding of how to maneuver to obtain this power, Stacey offers very few, if any, clues about what great things she wants to do with that power. We've seen that movie before, though, haven't we? Didn't we just finish 8 years of an unaccountable black president presiding over the greatest loss of black family wealth since we started keeping statistics on it? Didn't we just see 3 million American families lose their homes? Didn't we hear Eric Holder, the first black attorney general, tell us the banks were too big to jail and too important to investigate? And didn't we see Loretta Lynch, the second black attorney general, literally write the fine print on get-out-of-jail-free cards for Citigroup and other criminal investors who walked away with billions? We've lived to see a black president break his word on raising the minimum wage and delivering single-payer health care. The first black president blockaded and bombed all the countries the white presidents before him were blockading and bombing, and adding a few new ones, including the actual overthrow of a prosperous African country, where black Libyans and other Africans are being traded as slaves right now as a result of the Obama-Clinton policy. Didn't we see the first black president expand fracking around the world, privatize big chunks of public education, and let all the torturers and kidnappers in the U.S. payroll off the hook? Given all that, Why should we let Stacey Abrams and Lucy MacBeth, the progressive Democrats, and the rest off with not even a pretense that they're accountable for their stands on these issues where they intend to exercise the power granted by our votes? Why? Giving Stacey and the others room to figure out where they are on all this is not an option. They're all bright and well-informed people, especially Stacey. They know where they stand. They just don't feel obligated to let voters know. And why should they? Stacey is running against a crew of frank and open racists. It would be enough for her to show up with advanced degrees from humble beginnings, both of her parents preachers and apologetically black female with dreads. And what do governors have to do with foreign policy anyway? Well, the truth is that governors conduct foreign policy all the time. So do local governments down to cities and counties, where they decide whether to do business with ICE and how aggressive they want to be in funneling bodies into the ICE detention machinery. Joe Arpaio in Arizona certainly had his own foreign policy. So do Cobb and some other Georgia counties, and so does Brian Kemp. Stacey Abrams and her party will pay lip service to the scriptural notion that we are obligated to be kind to the stranger, but she surely knows that hundreds of thousands are fleeing Central America. Stacey knows the U.S. has invaded and occupied and bullied and blockaded Central American countries about 2 centuries now, putting in place the governments of gangsters and military death squads that have made those places the murder and human trafficking capitals of the world. The Central American refugees are fleeing the hellscape the U.S. military and economic intervention have imposed on their countries. Brian Kemp and Donald Trump want to greet them with theatrical cruelty, and that sells, especially to frustrated white Americans looking for someone to blame for their economic insecurity. In the face of that, pleas for kindness to the sojourner don't sell well. The truth that the U.S. created a hell people are fleeing from might sell, but it's a place Stacey and her party have never laid the groundwork to go and never intend to go. Hondurans elected a mildly social democratic president in 2014, and the black president's Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, lost no time letting the world know she favored a military coup to oust him. Stacey and her party never bothered to explain to Georgians that Medicare for all was, or what Medicare for all was, or to line up behind it. As a result, we got the Affordable Care Act, in which health care for 30 or 40 million was to come through Medicaid expansion vulnerable to interference in states under Republican control, like Georgia, which had the option of rejecting, and Georgia did just that. She also opened up more room for Brian Kemp to tell bigger lies about what Medicare for all is and what Abrams represents. That day in Ebenezer Church, where Congressman John Lewis told young black activists that free college tuition and health care were un-American. Stacey was almost certainly in the room and definitely in agreement with Lewis. If 8 years of Obama taught us anything, it's that a black president can do immense damage to the cause of black working-class families. Showing up female with dreads and riding on black girl magic just isn't enough. And keeping your politics on war and peace a secret until after you're elected, as Stacey Abrams, Lucy MacBeth, and a host of others are doing this year, is a sign of pure contempt and real disregard for the folks she expects to support her political career. We have indeed seen this before. Lucy, Stacey, and the rest can continue their careers without my vote. Thank you very much. That's Bruce Dixon writing in the Black Agenda Report about progressive Democrats this election and how much they are a snare and a delusion. And we don't even have a progressive Democrat running for Congress here. We just have an ordinary Democrat.
Bruce Dixon is under enormous pressure to vote for Stacey Abrams. So
Yes.
that's really something.
Exactly right.
And Stacey Abrams has, I'm pretty sure, been interviewed by Amy Goodman within the last few months.
Oh, yes,
since,
yes.
And is put forward as, you know, meet the black woman who wants to become the first black female governor of Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure that if she wins, we'll be seeing her on Amy Goodman by the time we do our next program. So let's see if we can report on that next week.
Yes.
How wonderful Amy Goodman says she is, and exactly what specifics Amy Goodman is going to use to talk about what it is that Stacey Abrams. I mean, certainly she won't repress the vote in Georgia the way Brian Kemp has been. What you could say that much for her.
And this situation, as specific as it is in the case Dixon's writing about today, he obviously means to be understood as generalizable, as an account of what progressive Democrats are offering in the current election. He concludes there's already a cohort of 30 or so CIA Democrats. We almost had one here in this district. CIA Democrats, that is, Democratic candidates for the House who are former spooks, CIA or FBI.
Naval intelligence.
Or naval intelligence. And that doesn't mean they know about their belly button, by the way. Naval intelligence and military intelligence in general. Democratic congressional hopefuls straight out of the military, police, intelligence, and homeland security world. Add those to the progressives who won't speak on the subject of foreign policy, and it looks like any congressional blue wave that hits will be mostly blue dogs, that is, right-wing Democrats. And we have indeed seen this before. Bruce Dixon, I'm afraid, is right, and we are going to see this next week.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. What do you want to do? What I have is a little too long to fit into that, so
okay,
maybe I'll save it till next week. It's about, and it's a little dated anyway. It's Doug Henwood's summary of the Federal Reserve report about the state of the American family, stuff like that. So, but anyway,
not that has any importance,
yeah,
of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just like you just have to keep getting back to looking at. We see in the New York Times this morning that the economy is running along just fine. The stated unemployment rate is as low as it's been since the 1960s, blah, blah, blah. We have to keep, reminding ourselves what the state of the workplace really is, what the indebtedness of families is, college debt, all kinds of things. None of this necessarily portends a repeat of what happened in 2008, but there are various factors that don't necessarily portend for the uplifting of the working class in this country, and there's no reason to think that the situation of the working class is much better than it was a year or two ago or 5 years ago, just because more of them are working. It's how are they working, and what is their children's future, and so forth. So I'll maybe delve into that more next week.
I must admit I am appalled this weekend to see all the exhortations to get out and vote on the grounds that if you're worried about where the country is going, if you're worried about what's happening, if you see fascism looming over the horizon, if you are concerned about the fact that the wars that the U.S. is conducting around the world are not even being mentioned, if you're concerned about the war provocations that the U.S. is exercising against Russia and China, why, go vote. That's the solution. That'll make the difference. Of course, you can't vote for things that aren't on offer. And there are solutions to these problems, like withdrawing troops from abroad, they're not on offer. So whether you choose the Democratic form or the Republican form, you'll get essentially the same neoliberal and neoconservative policies. Voting, in this case, is not the solution.
The New York Times this morning had the photograph of a 4-year-old Yemenite girl who they had featured previously, who they claim brought attention to the war in Yemen, and who has died. That is so manipulative, and so I mean, it's an awful thing, and it's an awful picture, and people, it should move people, of course, but the fact that they credit the photograph of this girl for somehow having raised consciousness about Yemen when they are the ones responsible for the lack of consciousness about Yemen. It's just so obvious and blatant. I don't know how people can't see through this stuff.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 44th week of 2018, a Why Vote edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.